So I want to sort of take a turn here. You mentioned your sort of history. You have a dual-sided history with your family and their experiences um, with the boarding school. Now, my next question for you was going to be, how did you come to get involved in this effort? And I still want to know that. But for those who will watch this video, they may be interested in knowing that you are a lineal descendant of Nicholas Blackout, who is currently being, well, his cause for canonization is open. It's moved from the diocesan phase, and it's with the Vatican now. You said Ben Blackout, which is his son, right?
Yeah, he went to Carlisle.
Mm-hmm. Now, given what we know of Carlisle, given its reputation, how did that affect, well, I mean, I'm not asking you to speak on his behalf, but did that have any sort of adverse effect on Nicholas Blackout, knowing what his son may or may not have gone through?
I think it's hard to say, and this is part of the process of the records, that are out there and that need to be found and discovered. I'll give you one anecdote of where this happened for someone else. I have a coworker who tells the story of her father who went to a boarding school, Pipestone boarding school, actually up in Minnesota, which is now closed, but they've made their records available, or at least the records can be accessed. And she told the story about how her father, who from 5 years old was taken to this boarding school and didn't see his family for a very long time until he finally left. That he grew up and left that boarding school and experienced the entirety of his adult life believing that his mother didn't love him and that his mother didn't fight for him, and had a very angry, he had a residing anger toward his mother for the rest of his life because of that experience. In his old age, after his mother had passed away, his children, were able to access some of the records from Pipestone boarding school. And in those records, they found letters that his mother had written to the superintendent of the boarding school, begging him to be returned, sending him whatever money that she could scrape by, to send $5 at some point along the line. Letters that weren't even opened, and letters that he, as a student there, never ever saw. And he was shown these letters and the letters were read to him. And she talked about just seeing her father weep for the first time ever in her life, to see him just sob and completely fall apart. But he also gained a sense of closure, having seen that his mother did try to fight for him, something he believed she'd never done. And it's those kinds of moments that are possible when we sort of do this work of opening the doors to the truth and to these records, as one element of it. From my own experience, right? I don't know what Ben Blackout's experience was. I do know that he started here at Holy Rosary Mission and then was sent to Carlisle later. I don't know why. We know that Nicholas Blackout himself was a catechist, that he had a great relationship with the Jesuits, that he also was, a part of this Holy Rosary Mission. Why did Nicholas send his son to Carlisle later in his life? I don't know that. And I don't know if the records would tell me something like that, but it might. And so that's the kind of information that families could discern more about when they have that access. Carlisle has made their records public. And so I was able to actually see some documents on Ben himself. And there is at some point a letter from Nicholas Blackout to Carlisle, inquiring about his son, and the inquiry is my son able to go to mass, because Carlisle wasn't a Catholic school, but they still arranged for students to be able to go to churches, and so the letter from Nicholas Blackwell to Carlisle was inquiring about whether his son is able to go to mass on the weekends or on Sunday, because he was older at that time, and at Carlisle at that time, older students didn't necessarily live on the compound. They were placed with families nearby. And so Ben was living with a rancher, I believe, while going to Carlisle. And they had to make sure that the rancher was taking him to his worship services. And again, I don't know the full story about that, but that is the one
Right.
letter I got to see that Nicholas wrote, inquiring about his son.
So when Red Cloud began the exploratory process of putting together what would eventually become Truth and Healing, how early on were you involved, and at what point did they, say, Maka, we'd like you to oversee this project?
When we first started to look into this, we initiated what was called a year of learning. The president of Red Cloud, who is new, he's our first lay president after we've had only Jesuit presidents in our history. So he was our first lay president, and he came in, and that really did, I think, initiate the openness to this effort. And when he looked into how Red Cloud interacted with the community, he recognized that there was this tension that we've always known, and we certainly have talked about, being, having been a student here and then an employee here for, a number of years, and a teacher. I know, and we all know, that there's a tension in the community with Red Cloud, that some people send their students here because it's the best, we're the best school in terms of college preparatory readiness, and that's the reputation we have. But they have hesitancy about the Catholic nature of us, or the history of us being a boarding school. And so there's a struggle internally that can exist, and we know it exists. And so when he realized that, I think he decided to ask the question that no one was willing to ask. And so that opened a lot of doors, and we spent the first year of this effort just learning. They set up a team of people, including myself, the Jesuit, who is the sort of pastor of the reservation, the head of all the churches here on the reservation, was one of them. There was another young Jesuit, a scholastic. We had one of our parish workers on the committee as well. We also asked a non-Lakota person who is Catholic to join. We asked a Lakota employee who is not Catholic to join. And so this committee, made up of different people from different backgrounds and different perspectives in this community, sort of representing a little microcosm of the community we live in, worked together in our first year to just learn. We went to the second conference held by the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. They're a relatively young organization, and so this was just their second conference in their time that they've existed. And we went together and learned together, and had these discussions and continued discussions throughout the year, meeting regularly and bringing things to read, interviewing people in the community, asking, what do you think of a reconciliation process? What would you think if we're engaged in a reconciliation process? What would you want to see? What would you not want to see? And doing that work to just collect all the information. And in the course of that year, we then sort of presented our findings and sort of recommendations. And one of those recommendations was to make this a real initiative, an authentic initiative that had sort of dollars behind it. And that's how the position was created. And I applied because I found that this work is so necessary. Even with my time as being a teacher of students from my own community, students whose lives I'm very familiar with because I grew up here too, and can see and recognize the same experiences that they've had. I know that um, the biggest, I know that the biggest challenge for me as a result of this history of colonialism is that sometimes I think Indigenous people are given a false choice. I call it sort of this false binary, where they're asked to either uphold something that is pure and indigenous and sort of revitalize and return to that. Or if they don't do that, then the choice is to acquiesce to something colonial and tainted and not part of what we were supposed to be. And this dynamic shows up in all kinds of different ways, in all kinds of different places, from, you know, conversations around things like who gets to be Lakota and talks about blood quantum, to things around education, you know, is getting a college degree whitewashing yourself? And there's all kinds of ways in which this dynamic rears its ugly head. And I think that's because, in part, that there is a reckoning that needs to happen with how this country came to be in terms of its history with Native people. And that entire process needs to be talked about, understood, and overcome. And I don't think we've done that. And I think this is one opportunity to engage in that dialogue, because I think it's even bigger than boarding schools. Boarding schools represent the larger project of what happened to Indigenous peoples in this country.
And with everything that's going on in the US today, the church is definitely becoming more invested in the conversation around racism and the ways in which it's been either actively involved or at least complicit in sort of racial injustice in the past. And what I see here with Red Cloud, and at least in the US church, Red Cloud may be sort of the catalyst for other schools and other communities to begin a similar process. It's obvious why it's important for the church to acknowledge these sins, because if the church is serious about, you know, fixing that relationship, if the church is serious about being Christ, right, being Christ to the world, it can't just talk about reconciliation. It has to be about reconciliation. It has to be about doing the hard work, doing the work that causes the church in a united sense to say, yeah, we messed up. We've been involved in some things that we're not very proud of. And obviously during this first portion, the truth telling phase of this endeavor that your school is undertaking, is there any other appropriate response you would look for from the church other than listening?
Yeah, I'm glad that you asked, and I think this is an important part of the conversation. The Catholic Church is has such a power in the world, and certainly in the lives of us Catholics. And I believe strongly that this work is sacramental. You know, I think of how we approach, for example, how we approach confession, right? How we come to God and lay bare our sins before Him and beg for forgiveness. And that is something that's so, you know, written into how we relate to our Creator, to Christ Himself. And this is the work that I think is so important, that I think the church can and is certainly it's baked into our DNA as a church to do this kind of thing. And so my hope and prayer is that absolutely the church, at the very minimum, listens. If the church can do more, I think it should. And certainly the church is not, uh, the church is made up of lots of people. The church, certainly in the United States, is represented by the bishops, and the bishops have lots of different ideas themselves and are not one mind. So my hope is that at the very least, Red Cloud can be a place where the church is listening. Listening is the first barrier and hurdle to overcome. And certainly for Indigenous peoples and Native peoples in this country, that is the biggest barrier to our, I think, progress, is that there's just so much lack of knowledge, so much lack of awareness around Indigenous peoples and the issues we face. So much so that we're still, that's still the task. Right? The task is still sort of just letting people know and spreading that awareness. So I think the church is a place that I hope that can start to grow.
You mentioned earlier that this process is 5 years to forever. And but for those who are watching, for those who may not have any direct connection to Native ministry or really understand the Native perspective in the Catholic Church, it's important to realize that what's beginning at Red Cloud Indian School and may very well spread into other communities across the country, this is not a moment, it's a movement. And it's a necessary movement forward, and I think it'll be transformative for the church. It'll be transformative for the communities who were directly impacted by this past injustice. In Maka, you mentioned earlier that the boarding school is not the beginning and end of the ills experienced between the church and Native people. There are many other areas that need to be addressed, and I think in time will be addressed. But I think I speak on behalf of the Tekakwitha conference and on anyone who may be watching right now. We are so appreciative of how brave you are and how brave the community is to be vulnerable, to allow yourselves to open the floor, whatever may come. Some, like you said, may not be ready to tell their story right away, but they'll come and they'll listen. And they'll hear other people begin to speak. And that'll empower them. That'll give them the courage to one day tell their story as well. For those who are watching who may want to know more about Truth and Healing, I know that Red Cloud released a sort of a public statement, like on their website. And that's one way to begin learning. But is there going to be a dedicated online presence where people can come and learn about this in the future?
Absolutely, yes. It'll hopefully be launched here, certainly by the time this airs. So if you go to redcloudschool.org, there will be a place for the Truth and Healing work to see how this began, sort of know a little bit more about it, see who is working on it, because the committee that was formed still exists, and they advised me in this position, and to see updates. That'll be a regular place to update what we're doing, and I hope that we're going to model the transparency that is a part of the whole reconciliation process, that we want to live what we're asking others to live. So I want to be very present with what we're doing. So yeah, that'll be where you can find out more.
Well, thank you so much, Maka, for coming today and for sharing this with us. Like we've said throughout this whole conversation, this is going to be a big part of the relationship between Native communities and the Catholic Church, I believe, in the next few years, in the next several years. And it's something that we're all going to have to be a part of. It's not something that only those who were directly affected. I think if you're watching today and you're learning about the boarding school period for the first time, that you're encouraged to go and to, to search the internet, to see what you can find, to look up all the different organizations that Maka has mentioned already. Because, if you're not a part of the conversation, if you're not listening, or if you're not telling your story, we live in a day and age where you can at least be informed. You can at least be aware. And you can join this movement through prayer. So we want to thank Maka Blackhawk for joining us for these videos, for coming on and talking about what's going on with Red Cloud Indian School and the truth and healing process. It's very brave of this community of Maka to step up as its leader. And Maka, we just want to thank you for coming and talking to us today, and sharing with us more about the process and more about how you got from that year of learning all the way to the point of launching this. So before we sign off, can you share a few thoughts and resources with our viewers?
Sure. I just want to start just by saying thank you. Thank you for having me on and having this conversation. I think it's something that certainly more people can learn about and know about. And with that, I hope that if you're someone who doesn't know much about Indian boarding school history, or you want to learn more, definitely check out the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition's website. They have numerous resources. You can also look to the Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which issued their final report in 2015, to see how that process went and sort of what the country, the nation of Canada, went through. And if you really want just a really visually poignant introduction to the history of boarding schools, Vox Media did a compelling 13-minute video on boarding school history as it developed and then moved into the adoption era, and how those two things are connected. And so that can give you just a little bit more background knowledge as to what this is and why it's so important today. So thank you for bringing me on and helping to promote this conversation. And I really hope that it is valuable to those who are listening. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Well, this is the conclusion of our conversation on the history of boarding schools and the healing that's going to come from these conversations. But as Maka has mentioned before there can be healing, there has to be truth-telling. And so we're excited to follow this process and to hear about what comes from it. We will be regularly sharing updates from Red Cloud Indian School as they become available. Obviously, this is going to be a multi-year process, but on behalf of the Tekakwitha Conference, we want to be supporters of this work. So again, thank you.